To meet you, Marco.
This will be the 11th year I've been running an industry that we're all different.
I would like to raise a glass to everybody's health and a good conversation, and may we all leave friends.
Yeah. Sure.
So, in each of your works, you have used the word empathy. And in using that word, I'd love to know, even in like a 10 to 15 word definition, how you have conceptualized it in your own brain. Obviously, there are multiple layers and multiple perspectives on how we dimensionalize what it means. But if somebody's reading your work and says, this word.
What is it?
Yeah.
Empathy is sharing the mental state of another person. It can be an affective sharing or it can be a cognitive sharing in the case of perspective.
Marco grunted when I asked that question.
Not that he's grunting at my answer, but we'll see.
That's what you think he was thinking, yeah.
I don't have a definition. I like them all. And I want to like them all. I want to embrace them all. It's emotional contagion. It is perspective taking, which is much more cognitive. It's a lot of things in between these big extremes of being just reflexive and just getting the pain or the joy of others, or being completely detached and understanding what's the mental state of others. And anything in between, I like all of it. When I like somebody to actually just find it.
When I visited Rob, I got a similar feeling from Rob when I asked him, when I asked you, what is empathy?
What did I say?
You actually, your answer I think was in the same neighborhood. Let's refresh it, right? So maybe it was one way then and now we've redefined it now, because obviously there's some flux, so.
So my basic attitude, I think like Marco's, is I'm not a fan of definitional exercises. We can define empathy as large as Marco just did. We can define it much more narrowly, the way Mary and Hellen just did. We can do anything in between. We can call it all empathy. We can call only one slice empathy and invent new words for the other ones. I'm not very interested in that kind of an exercise, as long as we among ourselves can clarify what we're talking about. Having said that, when we play with empathy, Adam and I, in our book, we're particularly interested in not exactly the thing that Mary Hellen was pointing to, but the thing that allows us to feel there's still a difference between me and the other person. There's a boundary. There's otherness. And yet I can cross that boundary. And we were trying to explore different ways in which that kind of a boundary can be crossed.
Because if there's no otherness, can you still legitimately talk about empathy?
And so you
That's
mentioned
kind of our
distinguishing sympathy and empathy has
Right.
something, so, I would call what Mary Hellen said sympathy, again, with everything I said about definitions thrown in there, and reserve empathy for the other thing, but I guess tonight we can talk about whatever we want.
Getting it all out on the table.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, one question that arises for me out of some of these different definitions is the question of agency, right? To what extent is empathy something that happens to you, and to what extent is it a choice that you make? And that seems to get to the question of whether we think about empathy as a feeling or empathy as an action, and just thinking about two of the phrases you used, emotional contagion versus perspective taking. Emotional contagion implies much more the model of empathy is something that happens to you. You see somebody hurt, it's like Adam Smith says, when you see somebody's hand get hurt, you retract your own hand.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of contagion of it, whereas perspective taking maybe could also be an involuntary thing, that somehow the perspective just comes upon you, but that seems much more like, okay, there's a boundary between me and this other, how do I cross that boundary? Or what do I say when somebody says their mother died? And so that seems like, in terms of the ethics of empathy too, like so important, like to what extent is empathy something we can choose to do or feel or experience, and to what extent is it a response?
That reference to Smith is great because that's exactly that's the imitation and that's the narcissism.
Right.
You're not going to help the person, you're taking your hand away. In other words, it's just an automatic reflexive imitation. It's not taking out, ripping up your shirt, making a bandage, and staunching the blood flow.
Maybe because I'm in mental health and medicine in general, but your use of the word narcissism, I don't think it's the way you actually think about narcissism. I mean, clearly you have this phenomenon, and these are all type 1 processes, but really automatic. They just, you can't help it, they just go on. And I think that, if you go back to the issue of culture that she raised, I would say that the emotional contagion probably is almost culture-free. I don't know if there is anything that's completely culture-free, but perspective taking is really heavily influenced by cultures. And so I think that if we start thinking about all these different dimensions, then you have a better grasp of how complex this big space is.
And in saying emotional contagion is culture-free, like what then does emotional contagion mean?
It means that if I see you smiling, I have this sense inside me that I'm kind of happy.
But if you see,
Even if she's an enemy?
That's a good point. But again, a lot of me, maybe because I haven't been around a bunch of guns in my life, but yours bring up really extreme situations.
They're not extreme situations at all. Look at the world today. I think it's a very important thing. Look at huge conflicts in former Yugoslavia, in Central Asia, in Africa. If a Tutsi sees a Hutu smile, will they also smile? I don't know.
I don't know either.
You just had this isn't an outlier, excuse me. This is throughout the world today. This is throughout the world today. I don't think I'm talking about, if you're talking about, a university environment, yes, then it's outlier. But if you're looking at the world today, I don't think it's an outlier at all. If you're looking at Christians and Muslims in Indonesia, does that work or not work in terms of that contingent? I don't know. But that's to me the important question.
My hunch is that probably, in some situations, very extreme situations, people have been having a war every day. Not necessarily work, but the example of different religion in a situation in which you didn't have an over conflict, I would say that just triggers, just clicks. It goes on because the body is the same.
These ideas that you're pulling up are totally legitimate, but at the same time, it's really important that we understand them within a cultural context. So the notion of self and other and empathy and this kind of, I feel this way because I think you feel that way and I used to feel this way, and this kind of interdependence, it's called, in self, is a very Western cultural construct. And it's not necessarily the way everyone in the world experiences empathy or sociality or pro-sociality, for that matter, or self. So that's the first thing to note. So these things are very fluid and they're taught over time, presumably because they're cultural. And then the other issue is that neurobiologically, you can speak to this too, Marco, if you prefer. I mean, what we're finding, when people experience and think about things relevant to their own self and have a kind of heightened self-awareness in which they're reflecting on things, and when they feel emotions about other people's mental states, and when they try to infer what other people are feeling, very much the same neural systems are recruited. Now, of course, the patterns of activation at a finer level of granularity than we can get at with our modern tools have got to be different, otherwise we wouldn't experience self and other as different. But they're the same neural systems that are being recruited for feeling emotions about your own mind and for having your own sense of self and for feeling emotions about other people's minds. These things are very,
About
very
dogs
closely
too?
intertwined.
About dogs too? What does it feel when the dog's in
Absolutely.
pain or the rabbit?
Yes.
I'm the person.
Sure. If you empathize in a way that you feel like you're sharing that, yes.
But there's a whole range of feelings Once you're talking about a range, there can be huge differences in their
Yeah, but
argument.
in real life interactions, people use much more what we call type 1 processes. They're automatic, they're stimulus driven, they're fast, they're efficient, they're not so flexible, but they're the things that make us attuned to other people in very simple way. So
Let's grant that empathy is partly behaving in a certain way that other people can understand as empathetic.
Okay.
And empathy is partly an emotional experience. Do we want to leave it as fuzzy as that? Because I think the default for most people is empathy is this emotional.
That's how most people
oneness.
think, yeah.
So take
And
it,
he's trying to suggest that, yeah, maybe some, but that's not the most important thing.
so take it back to the brain again. Exactly, you just laid it out perfectly. So if you think about this in terms of neural systems, again, chime in. If you think about this in terms of neural systems, you can sort of conceptualize in a very coarse way the way the brain organizes itself around kind of two systems that trade off with one another, and they're not simultaneously active. What's interesting for the purpose of this discussion is to understand that these things are different in timescale, and they're different in what they allow you to do in the way in which you engage empathically. So there's a kind of outwardly focused, action-oriented, context-driven kind of empathy, and that's the one you're talking about. And then there's another one which is detached from the environment, which can't be sort of simultaneously active with at the same time as you're engaging perceptually in an attentive way.
Cannot be, you
It
said.
cannot be. It's like a trade-off in attention mechanism. So you let down your outwardly focused attention in order to kind of reflect in an internal way where you just have enough outward attention that you can kind of navigate in a kind of automated way, but you're not paying a lot of attention when you're, say, driving home, in the traffic, and you're just thinking about what stuff meant. And that system is deeply connected with our personal memories, with our emotional states, with the sort of readout of our internal core body, the state of your viscera and how well you are and all these kinds of things. And so it's as if there is a neurobiological distinction between these two kinds of empathic behaviors that you're noticing sociologically are distinct. And there are different kinds of contexts and actions that lend themselves to particular kinds of empathic reactions.
So, empathy can be impeded. Empathy can be strengthened. And I'm interested in exploring
Okay,
what those levers are.
Good.
Right? Because one thing I learned from Marco is I give a little more attention to my subject and more of my mirror neurons fire. Right? With attentiveness comes a stronger empathic response. How am I doing? All right. But so if that's one thing that strengthens it, what else strengthens it? What else impedes it? This sounds like maybe the cultural gaps,
Well,
potentially.
I think culture is pretty important in terms of either impeding or strengthening. Opening up the possibility, maybe it's also opening the possibility to be attentive in a real way. In a real way to be attentive, not just...
I think it depends. I mean, the research suggests that it really depends how you conceptualize that person. If you're conceptualizing that person who's smiling as a Hutu when you're a Tutsi, then you're conceptualizing them as a member of the other group that you don't like. And then, no, you're not going to feel the same kind of empathy. But if you're conceptualizing them as another mother who lives next door to you, or somebody you know, then you will. So it's really the contextual framework.
Although what we know is that you could have people who conceptualized each other for 40 years as another mother, and then something happens and they're opposing
dynamic and they're fluid.
So it's all fluid. And what changes it is culture in terms of politics, in other words, collective social action.
You guys, let's take a quick break. We have some coffee over there, and when we pick up again, we'll gather over there in that other seating arrangement. So just take a couple minutes. Is empathy fluffy, touchy-feely, silly stuff?
So when Adam and I had written about this, we had two alternatives to that kind of notational nation-state, draw a hard and clear brick wall kind of a line that we talked about there. And they're both experiential in one form or another. One we just call experience, but what we mean is you lay the categories aside just temporarily. The river's flooding, we have to sandbag it, and let's go do it. And the other one is ritual. which always crosses boundaries in some sense. So the example that came to mind for me was when we occasionally teach a class together, and on the first, you know where I'm going, on the first day of class, we have kind of choreographed where one of us will say to one of the students, Petunia, will you please open the door? And Petunia stands up and opens the door and sits down, and we babble on about whatever. And 5 minutes later, one of us says, Fred, shut the door. And then we let a few minutes pass, and then we say, so obviously that open and shut the door thing, that wasn't because we wanted the door open and closed. We were doing something. Petunia, how did you feel about it? And Petunia says, oh, man, you asked me to open the door, open the door. And we say, Fred, how did you feel about it? And Fred says, I was pissed off. Why are you so rude to me?
He said, please.
You didn't say please.
He said, shut the door.
So, you know, the content of shut the door and please shut the door, it's the same, right? The substance of what you're requesting is exactly the same. It's this trivial, feely-weely, whatever the people who don't find empathy interesting are criticizing it for. It's that stuff. But who's going to drop the course? Fred or Petunia? Fred. Although we always choose like a graduate student who knows really well so he doesn't drop the course. Who's going to vote for you? Fred or Petunia? Who's going to shoot you? Fred or Petunia? It's not trivial at all, really, even though it's just the stuff, the daily stuff of life.
So the ritual builds a bridge upon which people can meet. If there's going to be empathy, it's going to be on such a bridge. I'm not saying it's the only bridge, but we need the bridge. And the bridge has to be constructed, and it doesn't need all this feeling to be constructed. It just has to be there.
And you're really speaking my language. That's exactly what I'm saying. It's about practice.
Yeah, it's all about
I
practice.
think that there's a fundamental agreement around the circle here about this.
I think the most important thing about empathy that you're all sort of dancing around too is that it's judicious, you know? Just indiscriminate empathy without boundaries makes me suspicious also. And also, not only because it's suspicious that it's actually real, but also because it's not effective. I mean, to be indiscriminately empathic with someone who has evil intentions, for example, right, is not advantageous for you.
For anybody.
And for anybody.
For anybody. It's not just letting go. You can bring yourself to behave in a certain way, and the feelings might or might not. So when I said you don't change, I mean internally you don't change, but your behavior can change.
Oh, actually, you're going to change it to that.
And at this stage of my life, if the behavior changes, then no, that's enough.
This whole concept of empathy, this whole discussion on how we're going to live together is really, really important, and it's going to be everywhere. And I hope that this is the first of many conversations like this. I want to repeat this format with different thinkers around the world. I think there's a critical question that we need to be thinking about, and some of you have already sort of tapped into some of these things. What are some adjustments that we can make right now that are going to bring us closer to that ideal? And if you can make your answer in sort of that understandable to a 6-year-old, that would be fantastic, because those are some of the people, as we know, that need to hear these kinds of things the most. What adjustments can we make right now? People who are watching this right now.
Say please and thank you.
Shut up and listen.
I would say the opposite of what Mark was going to say, which is take time to engage. Take time to engage in this kind of physical empathy, but also take time to reserve space to reflect on the meaning of it in abstract ways when you're out of that context.
Let's see if she was right.
Or we'll play.
Oh, yes.
Allow yourself to live in discomfort.
I want to know more about each one of your answers. Thank you guys so much. Thank you so much. You guys have filled me up, and I know that the team out there feels the same way. There's a lot of work to do still, I know it, but so grateful for your time, for your energy, for all the hard work you guys do. It made me want to reach out to you and bring you into this conversation. So thanks. If there were an audience here, we don't clap.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.